A 13-year-old mechanic girl from a forgotten Texas town just accomplished what a team of seasoned engineers couldn't. She fixed a $1 million prototype engine using nothing but her late father's tools, a worn-out notebook, and a gift for truly listening to machines. But what happened next? Her quiet determination not only brought the engine back to life, it challenged a corporate culture built on titles, inspired a movement of hands-on learners, and reminded the world that expertise isn't something you're given. It's something you earn. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. In the quiet Texas town of Redwood Bluff, where old trucks outnumber people and the air always smells faintly of dust and motor oil, lived a girl named Lillian Parker. At 13, she wasn't much taller than the workbench in her father's old garage, but what she lacked in height, she made up for in heart. Lillian's father, Robert Parker, was a mechanic, the old-school kind. Folks used to say he could fix an engine with his eyes closed and one hand tied. Before he passed, he taught Lillian not just how to hold a wrench, but how to listen to the subtle hums, rattles, and breaths of a machine. But not everyone saw what Robert saw in her. Most folks smiled politely when Lillian offered to help with their cars, but behind those smiles were murmurs. "Sweet girl, but she's just playing. What's a little thing like her know about engines?" The Parker garage had stood silent for months now, until the morning when a flatbed truck rolled in, hauling a broken V8 prototype that no one, no matter how experienced, had been able to fix. And as fate would have it, the girl they once overlooked was about to be their only hope. It was just after sunrise when the flatbed truck pulled into Parker's garage, its engine groaning under the weight of a sleek but lifeless V8 prototype. A crowd of men in crisp shirts and company jackets followed close behind, their faces lined with frustration and doubt. Among them was Frank Callahan, head of engineering at Drake Automotive, a name that carried weight in every garage from Dallas to Detroit. He stepped down from the truck, sunglasses hiding the exhaustion in his eyes. They had tried everything, every sensor, every diagnostic tool, every theory, but the car refused to run right. "It's a resonance issue," one of his engineers muttered. "We just can't isolate it." Lillian Parker was wiping her hands on a rag when they approached. She had been fixing up an old carburetor from a neighbor's lawnmower, just another small job to keep the dust off the garage floor. She watched as they lowered the prototype, sleek and expensive, onto the cracked concrete. Frank spotted her immediately. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, polite but dismissive. "Is your uncle or someone around?" Lillian wiped her hands again, walked straight to the car, and crouched beside it. She didn't respond to Frank. Instead, she placed her palm gently on the side panel, closing her eyes for a moment, like a doctor feeling for a pulse. One of the younger engineers chuckled under his breath. "She doesn't even know what she's looking at." Another added with a smirk, "You don't know anything about cars, do you, kid?" Lillian smiled faintly. She had heard it all before, but there, in the silence they didn't know how to hold. She heard something they couldn't, a vibration. Not loud, but persistent. It wasn't coming from the usual suspects. It was deeper, like a heartbeat just slightly out of rhythm. She traced it with her fingers, moving toward the rear exhaust system. "You've been focusing on the intake manifold and combustion timing, right?" she asked, not looking up. Frank exchanged a glance with his team. "Of course we have. That's where the noise is showing up on diagnostics." "It's not the intake," Lillian said, standing up, wiping her hands one last time. "It's the exhaust harmonics. You've got a micro-resonance bouncing in the secondary pipes. The noise is echoing back into the block, That's why it looks like timing. Dead silence. One of the engineers frowned, pulling up his tablet. That's not possible. Lillian shrugged. Possible or not, that's where it is. Frank crossed his arms. All right, kid, let's see what you got. With no hesitation, Lillian grabbed a wrench from her father's old toolbox and slid beneath the prototype. Her hands moved fast, loosening the secondary mounts, adjusting the spacing on a cross pipe that had been overlooked because, well, on paper, it shouldn't have mattered. But Lillian wasn't working from paper. She was working from feel. 20 minutes passed. The engineers watched, half amused, half curious. Frank stood in stoic silence. When Lillian finally slid out from under the car, she handed the wrench back to her father's workbench. Try it now. The ignition switch was pressed. The prototype came alive. Not just started purred, the hum was perfect. The noise was gone. The rhythm was clean. It wasn't just working, it was breathing the way it was designed to, the way no computer model had been able to predict. For a moment, no one said a word. Then Frank took off his sunglasses, eyes narrowed in disbelief. What did you do? He asked, his voice quieter now. I listened, Lillian said simply. That word hit harder than any technical explanation. Because she didn't diagnose the car, she heard it. The same way her father had taught her. The same way no program or spec sheet ever could. And in that moment, the girl they had all laughed at had become the only expert in the room. When the engine roared to life, it wasn't just the car that came alive. The entire garage seemed to breathe again. But Lillian Parker, she didn't celebrate. She simply wiped her hands and went back to organizing the tools on her father's old bench, as if what just happened was the most normal thing in the world. The engineers stood around, jaws clenched, not quite sure whether to feel impressed or embarrassed. Frank Callahan, though, was staring at Lillian as if he'd seen a ghost. He knew exactly how much money, how many hours, and how many top-tier specialists had tried to fix that car. And a 13-year-old girl had just solved it, with a wrench and her ears. But before anyone could break the silence, a new voice cut through the garage. Is this where all the Drake automotive geniuses are hiding? Everyone turned. A sharply dressed man in a tailored gray suit strode in. His name was Victor Lane, Senior VP of Drake Automotive. He wasn't here to observe. He was here to deliver bad news. I'm here to collect that prototype, Victor said, eyeing the vehicle. We're pulling it from the program. Corporate's had enough delays. Frank's face paled. Sir, we've just... Victor raised a hand, dismissing him mid-sentence. Unless you've got a miracle, it's over. Frank stepped aside, motioning toward the Charger. Start it. Victor looked annoyed but humored him. One of the engineers pressed the ignition. The V8 purred. Not a stutter, not a hiccup. It was flawless. Victor's expression changed instantly. He walked toward the car, hands on his hips, scrutinizing it like a man who'd seen a ghost. How he demanded. Frank pointed toward Lillian. Ask her. Victor blinked. His eyes scanned the garage, landing on the girl who was now casually stacking socket wrenches. You've got to be kidding me, he said under his breath. But Frank wasn't smiling. She's the reason this car is alive. Victor approached, his voice taking on that thin veneer of corporate charm. So, Lillian, is it you're full of surprises? Lillian turned to him, wiping her hands on her jeans. Not really. People just don't expect me to know what I'm doing. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. Well, you certainly gave our engineers a run for their money. Frank interjected. Sir, we need to talk about bringing her in on... Victor cut him off. No. This doesn't leave this garage. Understood. The room went cold. Frank frowned. Sir, with respect, she just fixed what our entire team couldn't. Victor's tone sharpened. Exactly why this can't leave here. You want headlines about how a teenager did what Drake's top minds couldn't. Investors don't buy from miracles, they buy from processes. Lillian tilted her head. Processes that didn't work. The engineers held their breath. Victor exhaled slowly, forcing a polite grin. You're sharp. I'll give you that. But you don't understand the business side of things. This isn't about who's right, it's about who's credible. The word stung, but not in the way Victor expected. Lillian had heard this tone before. The polite dismissal, the condescending smile. It was the same tone people had used when they'd told her father he didn't fit the corporate mold. It was the same tone that had left their family garage empty for months after he passed. But Lillian wasn't her father. She didn't need their validation. I don't care about your headlines, she said. I care about fixing things. Victor's grin faltered. Let me give you some advice. But before he could finish, Frank stepped in front of Lillian. No, sir. Let me give you some. You came here to scrap this car. This girl just gave you a miracle. And if you can't see the story in that, you're not the leader we need. Victor's eyes narrowed. The tension was thick enough to cut with a wrench. But then, slowly, the room shifted. The engineers, many of whom had chuckled at Lillian just hours before, began to nod, one by one, silent but firm. Victor realized he was outnumbered. He straightened his suit, forced a thin smile, and said, I'll expect an official report. But everyone knew this wasn't over. Lillian had done more than fix a car. She had cracked the foundation of a system built on arrogance. And as Victor walked out, Lillian turned back to the workbench, grabbing her notebook. She wasn't done fixing things yet. By the time the garage door creaked shut behind Victor Lane, the air inside felt different. For months. Parker's garage had been a forgotten relic, a place where dust gathered and old stories lingered. But now, there was an unspoken electricity in the room. Not from the purring prototype, but from the girl who had made it purr. But Lillian Parker wasn't celebrating. Not yet. She knew how people like Victor worked. They'd bury this, pretend it never happened, because admitting they were wrong wasn't in the manual. That's when Frank Callahan did something unexpected. He picked up his phone, scrolled for a moment, and made a call. Tyler, it's Frank. I need you to bring a camera crew down to Redwood Bluff. Right now. You're going to want this exclusive? Lillian's eyes widened. What are you doing? Frank smiled, leveling the playing field. Tyler was a reporter for a regional auto magazine, the kind of publication that thrived on stories the big corporations overlooked. If Drake Automotive wanted to bury Lillian's fix, Frank would make sure the world saw it first. And then, another surprise? One of the engineers, Sarah Kim, approached Lillian, notebook in hand. I need you to teach me what you just did, Sarah said, her tone sincere. Not the fix. The way you listened. That's something we were never taught. Lillian blinked, not used to people asking for her knowledge. But she nodded. All right. But it's not just about hearing sounds. You have to feel them, too. As Sarah and a few others gathered around, Lillian began to explain not with big words or technical jargon, but with simple, grounded analogies. She spoke about how an engine's rhythm was like a heartbeat, how every vibration tells a story if you're willing to listen. And slowly, the garage transformed. What had been a place of doubt was now a classroom. An hour later, Tyler's van screeched into the lot. Cameras, microphones, lights. It was more chaos than Parker's garage had seen in years. Frank wasted no time. He directed the crew, making sure they filmed every detail, Lillian's hands moving across the prototype, her notebook filled with sketches, the moment the engine roared to life under her adjustments. But the real moment came during the interview. Tyler leaned in, microphone in hand, and asked, "Lillian, you're 13 years old, no formal training, no license. How did you manage to fix what a corporate team couldn't?" Lillian looked straight into the camera, her voice steady. "Because I didn't start by assuming I knew everything. I started by listening." The simplicity of her answer struck harder than any technical breakdown. And within hours of Tyler's team uploading the footage, it went viral. The title read, "Mechanic Girl Fixes Multi-Million-Dollar Engine with Her Ears." Comments poured in. Thousands of them. Mechanics from across the country sharing their own stories of intuition over diagnostics. Parents tagging their daughters with captions like, "This could be you." Even industry veterans admitting, humbly, that they had forgotten the basics. But not everyone was thrilled. The next morning, a black sedan pulled up outside the garage. Victor Lane was back. But this time, he wasn't alone. With him stood Evelyn Sanders, Drake Automotive's chief operations officer, a woman known for cleaning up corporate messes. "Frank," Evelyn greeted coldly, "quite the storm you've stirred up." Frank didn't flinch. "We didn't stir it up. Lillian did. We just stopped you from sweeping it under the rug." Evelyn's eyes shifted to Lillian, who stood with arms crossed, grease on her cheek, unbothered by the suits. Victor, now visibly uncomfortable, added, "The board saw the footage. They're reconsidering their stance." Evelyn sighed, as if swallowing corporate pride. "Lillian, we'd like to offer you a position as a junior consultant. We believe there's a place for your unique perspective." Lillian tilted her head. "You mean now that everyone else believes it too?" The room held its breath, and then Evelyn did something unexpected. She smiled. "Fair point. But whether you believe it or not, you've just redefined what expertise looks like in our company. We want to build a program around that. With you." Lillian glanced at Frank, who gave her a subtle nod. But deep down, Lillian knew she wasn't interested in climbing corporate ladders. She was interested in opening doors for people like her, people who listened, who cared, who weren't blinded by titles and protocols. "I'll help," she said. "But it's on my terms. No more dismissing people because of their age, or how they look, or what school they didn't go to. You want me? You take the rest of us, too." Evelyn's smile turned genuine. Deal. And just like that, the girl they had laughed at became the architect of change. Within a week, the name Lillian Parker was no longer a whisper in Redwood Bluff. It was a headline across the country. The video of her fixing the V8 prototype had racked up over 1 million views. But beyond the numbers, something deeper was happening. Messages flooded in mechanics. Students, parents sharing how Lillian's story made them believe that skill wasn't defined by degrees or uniforms. But amidst the buzz, Lillian kept her head down, working in the same dusty garage with the same tools her father once used. For her, it was never about the fame, but it was about the work. One afternoon, Frank Callahan returned, holding a folder marked Project Ignite. He laid it on the workbench in front of Lillian. "This isn't a corporate stunt," he said, voice steady. "Drake Automotive wants to create something real this time, a mentorship program, for kids who see machines the way you do." Lillian raised an eyebrow. "You sure they're not just trying to clean up their PR mess?" Frank chuckled. "Probably. But here's the thing. They've seen how people responded to you. They know there's no going back. And they know you won't let them fake it." She flipped open the folder. Inside were blueprints, not for cars, but for community workshops, training hubs where kids from small towns could get hands-on experience. No entrance exams, no fees, just places where curiosity was enough of a resume. But the opportunity wasn't without conditions. They want you to lead the first pilot program, Frank said. Right here, in Redwood Bluff. Lillian's hands froze. Her garage, her father's old garage, could become the first of many places where kids like her, the so-called nobodies, could find their place. But doubt crept in. I'm not a teacher. Frank, I don't know how to run a program. Frank smiled. You taught an entire team of engineers how to listen, without even trying. You're already doing it. The decision wasn't hard. It felt right. Within days, the garage transformed. The rusty sign reading Parker's Garage was repainted, not to erase its history, but to add to it Parker's Garage, home of Project Ignite. The first day of the program, Lillian stood by the old workbench, notebook in hand, as a group of kids shuffled in. They weren't polished. Some were shy, some were loud. None of them fit the mold of a future engineer as corporate America liked to define it. But Lillian saw herself in every single one of them. She started simple. This is a wrench, she said, holding it up. It doesn't care how old you are or where you're from. It just wants you to know when to tighten and when to let go. The kids laughed. But within minutes, they were at work feeling, listening, understanding. Sarah Kim. The young engineer, who once laughed at Lillian, now stood beside her as an assistant mentor. She admitted that she had learned more in the past week from Lillian than in 4 years of engineering school. And then came the moment Lillian hadn't expected. Victor Lane showed up. But this time, he wasn't wearing a suit. He wore jeans, rolled-up sleeves, and a genuine look of curiosity. I came to see how the next generation is being built, he said, voice softer now. Lillian handed him a pair of gloves. Only one way to find out. Victor wasn't graceful. He fumbled with the tools. He got his hands dirty. And for the first time, he laughed not at someone else, but at himself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the garage lights stayed on. Kids, mentors, even Victor, working side by side. It wasn't about status. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about building something bigger than all of them. Frank stood in the doorway, watching it all unfold. You started something, kid, he said. Lillian smiled, wiping a smudge of grease from her face. No, Frank, we're just getting started. The garage smelled like motor oil and fresh beginnings. It had been a month since Project Ignite kicked off at Parker's Garage. But the transformation wasn't just in the building, it was in the people. Kids who once shuffled in with uncertainty now walked with grease-stained hands and proud grins. Lillian Parker had become their mentor. But she never acted like a teacher. She was just Lillian, the girl who listened to engines. And to people. But with growth came unexpected challenges. One afternoon, a boy named Eddie Morales showed up. He was 12, quiet, eyes always looking down. His father used to work in auto body repair before a factory shutdown left their family struggling. Eddie hadn't spoken much since, but he showed up, day after day, sitting in the corner, watching. Lillian noticed. One evening, after the other kids left, she found Eddie still lingering by the old Charger. You know, she said, leaning against the car. This old thing used to sound like a coughing tractor. Eddie smiled faintly. I fixed it, she continued, but not by force, by figuring out what it needed. People are kind of like that, too. Eddie looked up. How do you know what people need? Lillian shrugged. You listen. Just like with engines. That was the first day Eddie picked up a wrench. And from that moment, the garage wasn't just fixing cars, it was fixing confidence. Lillian's growth wasn't measured in accolades or interviews anymore. It was in the small victories. The way Eddie smiled when he got an exhaust mount aligned perfectly. The way Sarah Kim, once an engineer caught up in technicalities, now taught kids how to feel the machine first, read diagrams later. But there was one more transformation Lillian hadn't expected. Her mother, Grace Parker, who had spent months avoiding the garage since her husband's passing, stood in the doorway one evening. She didn't say anything at first, just watched as her daughter explained carburetor tuning to a group of teenagers. When their eyes met, it was as if a silent wall crumbled. Grace walked in, picked up an old shop rag, and without a word, began wiping down tools at the workbench, her late husband's workbench. She hadn't touched those tools since the funeral. Later that night, as the garage lights dimmed and the last of the kids had gone home, Grace sat beside Lillian on the tailgate of the pickup. "I was so scared you'd get lost in this place," Grace admitted softly. "That it would swallow you up the way it did your father." Lillian looked at her mother, the dim light catching the glint of a wrench in her hands. "I'm not lost. Mom," she said. "I'm building something. Dad built things with his hands. I'm building with my hands. And with theirs, too." Grace's eyes shimmered, and for the first time in months, she smiled, not a polite smile, but one filled with pride. But life has a way of testing conviction. A few days later, Lillian received a letter. It was an invitation. The National Engineering Youth Summit, a prestigious event where future automotive innovators presented their projects. Someone had nominated her. Lillian was floored. But with the honor came a familiar cloud of skepticism. "You're going up against kids from elite academies," Frank warned. "They'll have teams, sponsors, polished presentations." "I have Eddie," Lillian said, grinning. "He's learning welding now." Frank laughed, but deep down, he knew this was different. This wasn't just a competition. This was a chance to show that real expertise isn't about where you come from, but how you see things. And so, the Parker Garage team, Lillian, Eddie, Sarah, and a ragtag group of eager learners prepared for the summit, not with fancy slideshows, but with hands-on demonstrations. But as Lillian closed up the garage that night, she glanced at the old sign above the door. Parker's Garage. It wasn't just a name anymore. It had become a beacon. A place where kids who were once told you don't know anything about cars now taught others how to listen. Lillian Parker hadn't set out to change the world. She had simply refused to let the world define her. The day of the National Engineering Youth Summit arrived with more tension than anyone cared to admit. The venue was enormous, a gleaming convention center filled with high-tech booths, corporate banners, and students in crisp uniforms presenting projects worth thousands of dollars in sponsorships. And then there was Lillian Parker, walking in with a group of kids in mismatched overalls, carrying nothing but a portable tool chest, a few notebooks, and a model engine they had rebuilt from scrap. As they set up their modest booth, the stares began. Some curious, most dismissive. A few amused smirks echoed sentiments Lillian knew all too well. "Is this some DIY hobby project, cute? They're playing mechanics." Eddie shrunk slightly under the weight of those glances, but Lillian rested a hand on his shoulder. "Let them watch," she whispered. "We're not here to impress. We're here to show." When the judging rounds began, booths flashed with digital simulations, fancy presentations, and buzzwords designed to dazzle. But when the judges reached Parker's Garage booth, they found something different. No slideshows, no jargon. Just a small group of kids gathered around a running model engine, Lillian standing beside it, notebook in hand. "We won't bore you with specs," Lillian began, her voice steady. "You know them better than us. What we will do is let this engine speak for itself." She motioned for Eddie, who confidently adjusted a valve, tweaking the sound. This engine had a resonance problem. Lillian continued. No diagnostic tool caught it, but it was there, buried in the noise. We learned to listen, to feel it in the vibrations, the hum, the rhythm. One judge, a woman with years of experience in automotive acoustics, leaned in, intrigued. "You diagnosed this manually?" Lillian smiled, with a wrench, a notebook, and a lot of patience. As the engine purred flawlessly, the surrounding crowd grew. But the defining moment wasn't when the judges nodded in approval. It was when a corporate team, who had earlier laughed, approached with a simple request. "Could you show us how you did that?" Lillian didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply stepped aside, inviting them into the circle of learners. By the end of the day, Parker's Garage wasn't just a booth. It had become a workshop, attracting students, judges, even competitors who wanted to listen the way Lillian and her team did. When the awards ceremony began, Lillian wasn't expecting anything. But then the announcer paused and said, "This year, we're introducing a new recognition, the Craftsmanship Award. For those who remind us that innovation isn't always about new technology, but sometimes about rediscovering the fundamentals." And with that, Parker's Garage was called to the stage. As Lillian, Eddie, Sarah, and the rest of the team walked up, the crowd stood not because of the trophy, but because of what they had built, a reminder that expertise isn't about age, credentials, or titles. It's about care. It's about listening. It's about heart. Back home in Redwood Bluff, the sign outside the garage had changed once more. Now it read, "Parker's Garage, where machines learn to speak and people learn to listen." But the most important change was in the people. Eddie, once the quiet observer, was now teaching newcomers how to feel the subtle pull of a misaligned belt. Sarah had started a side project documenting the human ear method Lillian had perfected, hoping to integrate it into engineering curriculums. And Lillian, she still wiped down the workbench every night, still carried her father's notebook in her back pocket. But now, she knew the work wasn't just about fixing engines. It was about rebuilding how the world defined skill, expertise, and who deserves to be heard. The garage lights stayed on longer these days, and every time a new kid walked in, hesitant, unsure, Lillian would hand them a wrench and say, "Don't worry, we'll listen together." Because for Lillian Parker, the girl once told, "You don't know anything about cars." The world had finally learned to listen back. Anyone can learn to fix what's broken if they're willing to get their hands dirty and listen deeply enough. As the sun dipped low over Redwood Bluff, Lillian Parker opened a fresh page in her father's old notebook, not to plan her next repair, but to sketch out a workshop where every kid who'd once been told, "You don't know anything about cars," would hear a different answer. This time, no one would laugh them out of the garage. She knew now the skill she once kept quiet wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every kid in every small town who had been overlooked, every teenager with calloused hands and a heart full of ideas, and every person who had ever been underestimated. The little girl who was once told she didn't belong in the world of engines had become the mentor teaching others how to listen. Because for Lillian and for those who follow, fixing a car was never just about turning wrenches. It was about rebuilding belief. The end. Up next, 2 more stories that will restore your faith in perseverance. Click to keep building with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe skills come from passion, not permission.